Hi, everyone. On behalf of FSG, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Learning How to Learn, Embedding Intentional Learning into Your Foundation. My name is Hallie Preskill, and I'm a Managing Director of Strategic Learning and Evaluation at FSG. We have a great event for you today with some exciting speakers. I'd like to introduce Shara Reed, who's the Director of Strategic Learning, Research and Evaluation at the Kresge Foundation, Pamela Schwartz, who is Senior Director for Community Health Impact and Learning at Kaiser Permanente Community Benefits, Efrain Gutierrez, who's an Associate Director at FSG, and Caitlin Mack, who's also an Associate Director at FSG. Before we get started, I want to touch on a few housekeeping items. So today's event is 60 minutes long, and we encourage you to ask questions throughout via the white box on the right side of your screen. We will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. If you need technical assistance during the webinar, you can email customer support at blueskyelearn at support@blueskyelearn.com. You can also download today's slides as well as the Facilitating Intentional Group Learning Guide at fsg.org. Just click on the image in the lower right-hand side to open that page. Finally, the event is being recorded, and you will receive the recording link to your email after the conclusion of today's webinar. The content of today's webinar is based on the Facilitating Intentional Group Learning Guide that Efrain, Caitlin, and I wrote and published a few weeks ago. In case you haven't yet seen the guide, it provides an overview of what it means to learn with others and describes 21 activities that can be used to facilitate group learning. We were motivated to write this guide for a few reasons. First, the idea and practice of learning has been around forever and continues to be a topic of great interest in the philanthropic and nonprofit sectors. But people have been stymied when it comes to figuring out how to do learning in an organization or with others in a community. We wanted to demystify and clarify what it means to engage in ongoing group learning. Second, many organizations continue to aspire to be a learning organization, but believe they just don't have the time to learn. Thus, we wanted to show how it is indeed possible to embed learning into our everyday work. And thirdly, we haven't really seen many practical or actionable tools for folks to use to facilitate learning and thought a new resource would be useful. I'm going to kick us off with a brief overview of what it means to learn through our work. I will then hand it over to Efrain, who will provide additional thoughts about intentional group learning, and then we will hear from both of our fabulous presenters who have been able to integrate learning into their foundation's practices. We've left a good chunk of time after the presentations to address any questions you may have. So please feel free to write your questions in the chat box on your screen. Our wonderful colleague, Tiffany Clark, will be our question wrangler today, and we'll depend on her to organize and share your questions with the webinar's presenters so that we can address them as many as possible at the end. So let's think about what is learning. So there are two quotes here. The top one, learning is the process that enhances knowledge, which is a capacity for effective action. And this is from Peter Senge, who wrote the book, The Fifth Discipline, which is all about organizational learning. And we like this definition because it is the idea that we want to have knowledge, produce knowledge, and gather knowledge so that we can take better actions. So it's very action-oriented, and that's indeed what the guide is all about. So we came up with this rationale for learning. So a commitment to learning requires time, effort, and resources. Now I'm going to read this to you because I want you to kind of process it. It requires time, effort, and resources. That is, to support ongoing learning, whether it's in an organization, in long-term partnerships, or in learning communities, people need time to come together with a clear purpose for learning, with adequate planning and preparation, and with skilled facilitators. So what you're going to hear from our presenters today is how they've made the time, they've brought the resources to bear, how they've come at their learning with a real purpose and have planned it and thought about the facilitation. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Efrain, who will take us through a few more orienting pieces of information.
Thank you so much, Hallie, and I want to start my presentation just by sending a big shout out to immigrant communities across the country. Tell them how much we recognize their work and how much we just we're with them in these difficult moments. I want to start just giving a little bit more context before we hear from some of the examples we're going to be working on today. Invite you to start thinking about how to integrate intentional learning into your organization. I feel like sometimes we think that it's something really difficult to do, and we don't and it seems like you need to do a lot of planning, but I think that it's really important to start from what you already have and go from there. So what you see there on the slide are just some different meetings and places where people are already maybe gathering in your organization. I think as you start thinking about how to integrate intentional group learning into your work, it's important to identify where people are already coming together to share knowledge, to engage in dialogue, to have new experiences. So I'm not going to read the slide to you, but I want to ask you to think about, in some of the meetings that you're already conducting on your foundation and your organization, allocating a specific amount of time during some of the team meetings that maybe you already have to focus on a learning topic for 20 or 30 minutes. Something that we usually say is that this should be done at the beginning of the meeting, because sometimes if you don't do it at the beginning, you leave it at the end and don't do it. So if you want to be intentional about learning, put it first. So if you want to go deeper into conducting learning activities, you can start tthinking about other meetings that you can conduct, like an annual learning retreat or something of sorts that you can, where the organization or a team comes together and starts spending a day or half a day or 2 days just thinking about what are the things that we've learned and how do we move forward with our work. So that's just to give us some grounding on the structures and places. Think about what are the places in your organization where you can start learning. And then the second thing I wanted to discuss today was the goals of group learning activities. So as you think about integrating intentional group learning, think about how learning experience, in order for these experiences to be successful, it's important to identify and communicate a clear understanding of what needs to be accomplished. So the following three are three goals that we believe are particularly relevant for creating intentional group learning experiences. The first one is to individually and collectively it's about increasing our awareness and understanding and developing new perspectives. This is when groups come together to get a better understanding of a situation, a system, an issue. And as a result of coming together, they get a better understanding, they challenge their assumptions, and they come with new perspectives. So that's the first potential goal. The second one is to generate new ideas or solutions. This is when groups come together to identify and refine ideas that could inform the planning, the design, or the implementation of the work of a foundation or other organizations. And the third one is to make important decisions. So groups come together to learn and engaging in reaching consensus and agreement on a path forward. So these are not mutually exclusive. One learning opportunity or group learning opportunity can have more than one of these goals, but we believe that it's important to be really clear about what is the goal that you have for the meeting. Communicate that goal very clearly to make sure that everybody understands where do you want to get at the end of the meeting. And then finally, we're going to be discussing some of the learning activities that are included in the guide. And you can see the list of some of the activities that we're going to conduct. And in the guide, you are going to see a table that we have there. And I just want to go through some of the other considerations as you start thinking about how to integrate intentional group learning into your work, into your organization. Think about the people that you have, that the meeting is going to include. It's also important to think about the time that you have and the time that you might need to conduct a certain activity. It's also important to think about the goals, and we already went through them. What are the different goals that the learning activity might have? And there are other criteria that the guide provides around whether there's going to be quantitative or qualitative data that is going to be used for the activity, or if this activity can be done remotely, if people in different locations can do this activity. And without further ado, we're going to be talking about these different activities with some really good examples. We have really good presenters for you, and I'm just going to pass the microphone to Shara Reed from Kresge Foundation, who's going to walk us through some of the examples that she's been working on.
Thank you so much, Efrain. Again, everyone, hi, this is Shara Reed. I work at the Kresge Foundation. and I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to share with you today a little bit about what we've been kind of experimenting with in our growing learning practice at Kresge. And so just to get us started, I'm going to share an introductory slide that says a little bit about our vision for strategic and learning and evaluation here at Kresge. And that work is about, as you see, connecting learning with action, which sounds simple, but it's actually quite hard to do, well documented, that actually using what we're learning and using what's coming from our evaluations and learning activities is elusive and can be challenging. And that work for us is about enlivening our values in service of our North Star, which is about expanding opportunity for low-income people in urban America. So just a few assumptions about assumptions going into the work in particular that I will share today. So one is that at the Kresge Foundation, we really desire to become a more intentional learning organization. And the intentional, I think, is the piece that I pick up on. So we actually do have to do something. As Hallie outlined, we have to make time for learning. We have to have strong facilitation. We have to have a plan. Another assumption that we're making when we get together to do strategic learning is that adults learn when they need to. So something has to be at stake that matters to those people who are in the room in order to get their best thinking. And a third assumption is that if we're going to spend time together when we sometimes struggle to find time to learn, we've got to have fun. So I'm always trying to balance all of these things going into the work. I'll also just note here that for us at the Kresge Foundation, strategic learning and evaluation are necessarily intertwined. We try not to take an approach that says we will now evaluate and then over there we will now learn. We aim to be action-oriented and to connect our strategic learning and our decision-making. So our goal of learning together in the particular activity that I'll highlight today is really that first goal that's was highlighted in Ephraim's presentation. It's about individually and collectively increasing our awareness and understanding to develop new perspectives. And really key here is that we really, in this case, are trying to understand competing and complementary perspectives around a big, hairy issue that I'll get into next. I also want to note that in this particular context, we have a desire to understand better systems thinking, and we really needed to practice that together. So just setting the context here on this next slide, here at the Kresge Foundation, we have a structure which is a monthly program forum, a gathering of all of our program staff, our social investment staff, our program operations department coming together to really practice this, gaining this muscle of learning together. We have 90 minutes once a month to work together, and we have rotating topics. For this particular session that I'm going to be reflecting on, we used a few different resources. So we pulled together and blended the resources that we needed to really practice systems thinking. And I do this a lot as a facilitator of learning in my organization, just noting that. So you'll note that I'm pulling both resources, in this case, from Grant Makers for Effective Organizations and from FSG, a couple of resources from there. And I would encourage everybody to do the same. Get what you need to support the learning in your organization. So what do we actually do? We practice systems thinking using trend mapping. And you can read here about what a trend map is all about. There's much more detail in the FSG guides that are available for download for free. And what I want to highlight here is that this was kind of the compact that I made with my colleagues in the organization, is that as we're thinking about trends, one, and I will point you to the very last arrow, the value of this map depends on you. This was my colleagues and myself. We all have to share our knowledge and experiences. And then another thing just to note here, I've used a number of the learning activities featured in the guide, and many can be used in lots of different situations. I often will blend them. I made the decision to go deeper on trend mapping today, so you can actually see something about the evolution in our thinking. So you'll get to see, I see there's a question about what a trend map looks like. Without further ado, that's where we're going, I promise. And I also just want to note that trend maps are really lovely as an inductive approach, and this isn't in the guide, but it's really an inductive approach to understanding what opportunities we might have to work together in our case. Right? It's an inductive approach to surfacing what we aren't working on. We sometimes ask people the really hard question, so what else should we focus on? This trend map actually gives us a way of getting there without asking the question in a more deductive way. So what is it? Here we are, getting started on the trend map. In this case, and it's a little hard to see, you'll see it better on the subsequent slides, the trend, that we decided to focus on topically is equitable community development. Essentially, that is our North Star at the Kresge Foundation. You'll see there blue and yellow Post-it notes here. The blue stands for those impeding trends. The yellow are those supporting trends. So what supports equitable community development? What hinders or impedes equitable community development? The red and yellow dots are our voting, what's most urgent in our work. And the instructions here included to please first write on your own, and the slide just before talks about sort of the parameters. What are we talking about? So everyone took a few minutes to write on their own Post-its. Then we all got up and we clustered what sounded similar, started to place these trends onto the map. And the next step was really to start to ask, where do we see connections? What goes with what? Don't name it, just hey, if I'm writing, hey, social media, maybe there's a relationship there. And so my colleagues started to come together and say, hey, my Post-it looks something like your Post-it. What were you thinking when you wrote social media? And so conversations ensued from here. We also started to group, again, what looks similar without naming it. And there were things that it looked like, maybe there's something about mass incarceration evolving here. Is there something about community engagement, about engaging residents as decision makers? Let's see where that goes. And next, we went ahead and named the trends. And so I asked groups to actually, and we had about 30 people working on this, ask colleagues to start to collectively name the trends. So we circled them or put little blobs around them, if you will. And so we saw that there are some trends such as creative placemaking, and that really is cross-cutting across our work. It's an area of practice here at the Foundation. We have this really lots of energy around racism. Racism isn't something that we necessarily talk about day to day in our organization, but there's a lot of energy there. We were able to name, human capital, people. What about people and equitable community development? What is that? So we just started to name these trends, understand something about, again, what's impeding progress, what's supporting progress, and where is the energy in this group? I will also note here that at the Kresge Foundation, we have 6 pretty unique program or grant-making areas, and a practice area focused on American cities across the board, and a practice area focused on social investment, the use of multiple forms of capital. Our norm is not to work together every single day and to see connections across all of our work. So this is very intentionally an exercise in practicing to see where we might have shared interests and connections. This is necessarily a practice of learning together. And so then we ask the question, what opportunities do we see? What could we do that we're not doing currently? What's possible? And I wanted just to share a few things that came out for us. One is that the reality that racism stretches across equitable community development, that is a challenge, and that we were able to name that where we previously had not named that at the group level, so across departments to say as much. And so it called the question to us, should there be something more explicit in our work? And I am really proud to say that as a foundation, we are increasingly adopting an equity focus within our work. We're beginning to speak more publicly about the need to focus expressly on race and all of the intersecting and interlocking identities that affect opportunity, really equitable opportunity for people in urban America. A second thing that has really risen up for us I would say influenced by, I can't say completely as a result of, but influenced by this practice together, is that we're thinking a lot about human capital, and we're recognizing that across a number of areas in the foundation, we are supporting growing next generation leaders. We're supporting people who are in their early career. We're recognizing that there is some shared interest, that there is a there that we need to be talking about more together. And that most recently for us has shown up in both some internal and actually an external engagement that we participated in a couple months ago with Living Cities. We're also increasingly lifting up cross-sector collaboration and practicing understanding what is this ecosystem that we're all talking about or we mean to be talking about. We have a meeting scheduled in just another week to actually get together with a couple of our practice areas, program areas, to talk about ways that we can better understand what we mean when we say opportunity ecosystem. So all to say, there's a lot of places that as we ask the question, what opportunities do we see? Where is the energy? What are we not focusing on? What are the opportunities that stretch above and beyond what we think we're doing today? What has not been named? For us, the trend map has been an excellent opportunity to really open up conversations across the organization. It's really allowed us to practice learning together, to find connections among colleagues that we didn't necessarily know were there before, because we made the time and the space to practice this work together. So with that, I'm going to thank you. After Pamela Schwartz from Kaiser presents, we will be taking some questions and hopefully offering some more insights and maybe more questions. So I'm going to advance over to Pam, and we look forward to your questions to follow. Thank you.
Thanks, Shara. So I'm going to give you a bit of our learnings from implementing our learning strategy at Kaiser Permanente in community benefit. I'll talk a little bit about how it came about and provide just a flavor of some examples, and then I'll touch on our future directions. And first, a little bit of background. So our work at Kaiser Permanente Community Benefit cuts across many complex issues, many of which relate to the social determinants of health. So we take on things like healthy eating and active living, access to health care, economic security like affordable housing or job creation. And as you all are experiencing as well, the context we're operating in is shifting as communities' needs change and also as the political environment changes. So as this complex environment changes, then our staff, our leaders, our board, and even our regulators are seeking ways to ensure that we're contributing to improve community health. So how did we get started? It was a combination of factors that led to creating a new system for measurement, evaluation, and learning. For example, our community benefit work had grown and become more complex over the years, but we didn't have a measurement strategy to match that. There was also growing interest in measurement coming from our board, all our leadership really, including our board. And then the external environment was asking for us to report on things in new ways. So we knew we had to do something to have a more comprehensive approach. And we intentionally added learning as a part of this package. And for me, this is the part that excites me the most about what we've done. Together with FSG, we created an overarching evaluation, measurement, and learning approach. We call it MELLOW. It stands for Measurement and Evaluation for Learning and Outcomes. And we began by building a shared understanding of our strategies and the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So to do that, we created theories of change, learning questions, common indicators, and outcomes. And along the way, we involved, over 300 staff members in an attempt to make sure that what we were producing best represented our work. And it became clear along the way that it was going to be more than a plan or process or a set of products, that this work required a commitment to changing the way we learn together. So the products were super helpful, but it became clear very early on that we needed a way to operationalize the work, really a plan to make it real. And by that, I mean, we needed to move from, for example, a laundry list of learning questions to prioritize which ones we would take on first, with which data, what were the learning activities, specific learning activities and timelines, who was accountable, what were the actual meetings that this learning could take place, really just making it real. And over the long term, it's also meant considering staffing, roles, resources, infrastructure, and a willingness of our staff and leaders to go in this direction. So in a nutshell, we needed to quickly move beyond the products to something that could make it real. So before we could really get started, we needed to understand our environment better. So we used the role survey to assess our colleagues' readiness for learning. And so this is, the role survey stands for Readiness for Organizational Learning and Evaluation, developed by Hallie and her colleague, to really take a look at the organization's readiness for all of this work. And it looks at constructs like culture, leadership, systems and structure, communication, teams, and of course, evaluation. But we used the survey data not just as an assessment, but as a way to really begin to demonstrate the value of learning. So we tried to engage our staff in different ways as we were looking at the results. So we really rolled up our sleeves to take a deep look at the data and what it means. You can see some of that going on the right of the slide. And in the past, we might have delivered the survey results with something like a presentation followed by a Q&A, which many evaluators do in all kinds of situations. But we asked our whole team instead to interact with the results. So as you see on the right, there's a bunch of data on the wall and a lot of stickies where people are reacting to it. And we had the same learning goal that Shira presented, this increasing awareness and understanding and developing new perspectives. So we implemented what's called a data gallery, and this is where our staff collectively reviewed the results and heard each other's perspective on what the results meant to them. And I have found it really helpful as we've been testing out these learning activities to combine the data gallery with a second learning activity that is what, so what, now what. And this learning activity engages staff in developing ideas for addressing some of the challenges and opportunities, and in this case that were identified in the survey. So we asked folks to think about, okay, what are you seeing here with the data? What does it mean for you? And now what are we going to do about it? So it was more than increasing awareness. And then we wanted to do something with our results. So we wanted to take the next step beyond increasing awareness. And the good news is that we had some really high scores in measurement, evaluation, and learning from the survey. So the foundation and willingness was there. But in an effort to further explore the data, we wanted to begin to address the barriers to effective learning. And so we implemented 2 more learning activities. And this wasn't actually just to go deeper. It was also to train our staff in how to implement learning. So we were trying to test as many of the activities in the toolkit as we could to really get a flavor of what we liked, what worked for us. So on the one hand, it was to further explore the data and go further into planning solutions, but it was also to practice, to kind of build our learning muscle. So we first implemented a modified appreciative inquiry. So the reason we chose this is our survey results, they told us that we were risk adverse. And so we used a storytelling exercise, part of appreciative inquiry, to call out examples of when we took risks, both personally and professionally. And we talked about the good things that came from it. Then we implemented a second learning activity called World Cafe, and this was to really go deeper, to further explore ways to increase opportunities for risk-taking in our work. So we posed a set of questions to our colleagues for discussion in small groups and forced folks to sit knee to knee, so it was an intimate process, but it was building off of the appreciative inquiry stories. We asked folks, what are 3 things that we could do to create conditions that allow staff to take more informed risk? So now we were also trying to address the barriers identified in the survey. So not just talk about it, but really do something about it. And each time we implemented a learning activity, we always took the time to reflect on how it was received. So for example, we were constantly asking folks as we rolled out different activities, what they would have preferred, if they would have preferred to receive the survey results in an email or PowerPoint instead of using the data gallery, and you can guess the response. And we found that the more we engaged our colleagues in learning activities, the more of an appetite there was for more. And the more we trained our colleagues in how to conduct these kinds of activities on their own, or at least why they should do it and how to build it out in their agendas with learning in mind throughout the agendas, the more they wanted to carry it out on their own. And moving forward, I think there's more from the role survey that will help us really understand how to get ourselves ready to do more of this. We need to deploy further changes in our department. For example, we're sitting on over a decade worth of data, but sometimes it can be really difficult to find what you need. And we'll be exploring ways to make sure that we're collecting the most useful and relevant data, and also taking into consideration, making sure we're minimizing the burden for both our staff and our grantees, but wanting to make sure that it's accessible so we can really use data to better inform our decision making and really use it for more learning to drive decision making. So here is what where our future is. We are trying really hard to spread this learning thing. We're building a cadre of staff to spread the culture of evaluation and learning. And to do that, we've been exposing our folks to as much training as possible, as fast as possible, and asking our folks to incorporate it into their work. So on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see we have these learning plans to help guide our work. So it was helping us to get into traffic, to really make a plan when and where and what activities, like I said earlier. But we found that these plans are super iterative. For example, FSG helped us create this plan back in December, but already by now it's outdated. So we need to make sure that we're just making it relevant all the time and making sure we're posing the right questions with the right activities in the right set of meetings with the right data. So those kinds of things. And then beyond this, we're also spreading more of our mellow work across the program. And we're finding that our colleagues are using the products in many ways. For example, we're seeing the learning questions show up in RFPs for new initiatives. We're seeing our folks work in new ways with grantees with a set of common indicators or common learning questions. And we're organizing our meetings and sharing data differently in many settings, many of that laundry list that Ephraim mentioned. And also the work is influencing how we interact with our board. So really thinking about how we communicate our work in new ways. I think the bottom line is our colleagues are really taking this and running with it, and the data and learning activities gave us a structure for the work, and now it's actually hard for us to keep up with the demand. So we're trying to figure out what are the learning activities that fit our culture the best and under what conditions. So as I hope you've heard me say, this is a journey. We realize that becoming a learning organization is more than a set of products. It's more than a plan or a process. It requires a commitment to change and getting clearer with ourselves and our leaders, grantees, partners about what it is we're striving to accomplish, and changing the questions that we ask, how we ask them, and actually taking the time to answer them. It means aligning our measurement and evaluation approaches and using data to intentionally drive strategy. This has been said before in the framing, but I can't emphasize enough the importance of intentionality. And the second thing I'd like to emphasize is allowing enough time for reflection and learning. That is really key and super hard to really make the time for it, but we've seen it really pay off. And just one recent example of how we're making this real and really shifting our approach to the way that we do our work is there's been a change in our policy landscape for all of us, really, probably on the call. And for this, we're a healthcare organization. And for this, it included, understanding what's going on in the political environment and in particular in the future of the Affordable Care Act. And so as we started to try and anticipate the unknowns for this year, we brought together our leadership team to develop a shared understanding of what was going on and the implications for our communities. And we used learning to guide our agenda. And our aim was to really allow time to be thoughtful and reflective, and we wanted to be informed by data, and we gathered as much quantitative data as we could, but what was even more important probably in this activity was to really bring into the conversation our rich experiences. So really bringing the qualitative piece of how is the political context playing out in our regions, with our communities, with our partners, and really proactively using this information to design the next iteration of our work. So we use structured learning activities, in this case, again, a data gallery followed by a what, so what, now what. You can see that I have a favorite here, a favorite set of activities. But we use this to really begin to understand the context and start to explore solutions. So this is going to be an ongoing process for us, but this was really a great way to get started with something super challenging. And we're seeing examples like this in many aspects of our work. taking the time and using data in this way is new for us. We've been trying to do this really for just about, a little over 6 months maybe. And the response from our colleagues is super positive and exciting. And we're really just beginning to understand what's possible. And we know that we need to refine it along the way. And again, it's really just a journey, an iterative process, and super exciting to do this together. With that, I will turn it back to Hallie to see if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Shara and Pam. Fabulous. So excited to hear your presentations. I want to invite folks to go ahead and share with us some questions you have. That's great. But before we actually start the Q&A, I just want to kind of reiterate a couple things and just highlight a couple things. You notice the word intentionality or intentional in the heading, and that use of the word was very intentional. I think what Caitlin, Ephraim, and I wanted to do with this guide was to really put forth the notion that you have to be deliberative, you need to be purposeful, and you have to actually be planful when it comes to learning. As human beings, we're always learning all the time. As long as we're breathing, we're learning. But what we're learning, how much we're learning, the depth of our learning, it's going to vary. And it may not always, people may not always be learning what they need to learn. And probably most importantly, if an organization wants to become a learning organization, team learning or group learning is the bridge between individual and organizational learning. So it's imperative that when people come together, that they are learning from each other, from their experiences and from data that can be brought into conversations. And as Pam said, it really is about building muscle and building capacity. So if we can bring, this intentionality as we're gathering people for staff meetings or community practice or community meetings or learning retreats, whatever they are, the more we can bring in activities that help people reflect and engage in dialogue, the stronger our connections will be with each other, but also the more we'll be able to take away and embed into our practice and into our relationships with a variety of folks. So, and as Pam says, the more you practice this, the more it becomes just natural. And it doesn't become a question of, do we have the time to learn? Or do we have the time? It just becomes part of how we put our agendas together and how we spend our time together. So just wanted to kind of call that out and reinforce what both Shara and Pam have shared. So we do have some great questions coming through. Let's start with Shara, if that's okay. Shara, there's a set of questions about the process of the trend mapping activity. And someone asked, or a couple of people kind of asked the question, so you worked with a group of 30. Did they all work on the same map? What was the first question you used to start the question on, to start the discussion on trend mapping? Were there next steps after this activity to capitalize on the insights? If you wouldn't mind sharing a few more details about the activity, that would be great.
Yes, I'm happy to. Thanks, Hallie, and those who asked the questions. So yes, we all did work on the same map, but we did start the work individually. So colleagues were invited to write down trends, whether impeding or supporting, increasing or decreasing on their own. So there was that initial think time, and everyone was actually seated in small groups. And so the groups did discuss a little bit at their tables as they sort of wrapped up writing. And then folks got up to start actually plotting the trends or plotting what looked like it went with what, grouping, before naming. The second question is, what was the first question that I used to start the trend map? So the first sort of open discussion question was, what excites you? What energizes you about what you see? And probably not surprisingly, the next question was, what frustrates you or what do you think looks really challenging here? And the third question here is, were there next steps after this activity? Any other explicit follow-up did we either do or did we plan to do? So we did have an explicit follow-up that was planned that was actually to continue thinking about like what could happen next, what might be next. And so the conversation actually happened in a subsequent meeting, probably about a week later, with a couple of colleagues in particular who were really interested about the ways that mass incarceration and racism in particular showed up. and wanted to think about what we could do, how we could actually embed more learning about each of those into a different forum, a different working group that exists in the foundation. And so we've been able to, to pick that up a bit. But I will also say for us, I think I didn't mention this earlier, that the particular forum in which this learning activity, this learning event happened, our standard format leading up to this was actually to have a guest speaker who kind of did a stand and deliver presentation, and then we would all go back and continue on the way that things were before that event in most cases. So it was a very big step for us as an organization and as this subgroup to have a colleague facilitate the discussion. To practice learning together in this way was really quite new for us with this configuration of colleagues. It was really a new compact for how we might work together.
Fabulous. Thank you, Shara. The next set of questions, it's interesting. Many of you have picked up on the idea that to embed intentional learning activities in an organization requires creating a learning culture that suggests that leadership has to support learning, that it has to be okay, not only okay, but expected that time is made to reflect and engage in dialogue with each other. And so the next set of questions are around the building of that culture and how you've embedded intentional learning in your organization. So this is for both of you, and Shara, Pam, perhaps you'll go first, and then Shara will follow. And these are questions, there are a few, and I think they're related, so pick up on these wherever you wish. What suggestions or tips do you have for others who want to try to embed intentional learning into your organization? And then someone said, being intentional requires a lot of time, but many organizations don't make the time to do it. What suggestions do you have for the leaders of an organization to make this a priority? And then another culture question, how is creating a culture of learning different when the audience is the foundation board versus the staff? So to pick up on any of those, it's about, embedding and creating the culture and engaging leadership in this whole learning endeavor. So Pam, you want to go first?
Okay. I think the easiest answer and the realist answer is you just have to try it, and baby steps with early adopters. And so for us, the way we started is with training to get on. FSG provided us training in how to implement as many learning activities as possible, so that we could practice it and really figure out which ones we liked and how you could use them under what conditions for what kinds of data. And it was a way to get people to know what it is, because it's kind of hard to know. Like when I added learning to our scope of work, I didn't really know what it was, really. And so really learning is something you just have to dip your toe in, I think, and start to play it out. And what I saw happen in our organization is that the response was super positive. So I made sure that, well, a couple things. I made sure that we trained as many people as possible in as many activities as possible, and that included our evaluators. We have evaluators across the program, and also our consultants who were doing external evaluations for us. I brought them into the training so that the work that they did on our behalf was also done with learning in mind, so that they were changing the way they deliver their evaluation efforts with us and perhaps with the rest of their funders and work as well. And then also I had our staff, our program staff, brought into the mix of the training and implementing, so that it wasn't just reliant on evaluators to make sure this was rolled out and to make sure it made it to agendas and so on. So I think it was really just training and then exposure, and then the other thing is make sure it goes well. The first few that you do, make sure they go really well, because you want people to like it. And so you have to plan it well, in particular at the beginning. And I feel like I'm still at the beginning, so I still need to keep an eye on, are we doing this right in the way that is that people are going to find value in it. So I'm not taking a whole lot of risks yet with it, but just making sure that we're exposing people to a positive experience. The question with the board is harder. I haven't fully engaged the board yet in this, and I have to think about when and how I do. They know that we're doing it, and so they know what it is and how it's playing out across the organization. But we haven't implemented learning activities with our board of directors yet.
Great, thanks, Pam. Shara, some thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So happy to talk. I heard that there were sort of three streams of questions. One's about embedding and finding time. I heard a question about culture, and I heard a question about leadership, both senior leadership as well as engagement with the board. And the question of embedding and to some extent creating a culture, I'm completely with Pam. You have to start, and you have to be open to experimentation. It can be really scary, and particularly if you're new in your role. I was new in my role about a year and a half ago. I am the first Director of Strategic Learning Research and Evaluation ever at the Kresge Foundation. We're almost 100 years old. And somebody asked how many people, what's the team? And I'm a 1.0 FTE focused on this. I have the wonderful opportunity to work with great consultants like the folks at FSG on particular activities and projects, and some others as well. But day to day, I am often the person who is the lead facilitator of strategic learning within my organization. And so it's really important to get started and to try some things. And I think one of the other things that I am learning is that if we say it's now time to learn and we separate learning from what people see as the work, we probably are not going to get too far. Learning is part of the work. It is embedded in the work. It has to be connected to the work, or otherwise folks are not going to want it. And so equitable community development, I don't know honestly that would have been my first choice of topics because it is such a big topic. On the other hand, it is our North Star in our work here. And so that is what's pressing for my colleagues. That is what we are about. So that's where we started for this particular learning activity. And so it kept the work at the center. It created an opportunity for everyone to be engaged, to bring in their point of view. And in this, another piece for our work has been, it doesn't matter what your role is in the organization or your level of seniority or longevity in the organization. We are fundamentally acting from the perspective that everyone needs to bring their best thinking to the table and that we all have something to contribute that's of importance. So really, really important for us. On the question of how you engage your leadership, I'm still learning a lot about that. What I found is, again, really important. It has to be about the work. So the value add that I bring to my president in the organization, I believe, is actually helping us take the things that are already on his calendar to that next place, a step further. Another value, I think, in particular, bringing strategic learning to the table is actually providing some continuity. Our chief executives, our boards, people are really busy and pulled in a lot of directions. If there are things that come out of these learning activities or other things that we do in our roles as facilitators of learning in our organizations that connect where we've been to where we are to where we're trying to go, I think that has tremendous value. And if there are ways that we can do that, again, whether that's through the formal kinds of activities we're talking about today, or through in more informal or tacit ways, I think that's really critically important and great value that we bring.
Thank you, Shara. Fabulous, and thank you, Pam. So here's a tactical question. I think it's a real practical question, perhaps. And Pam, I think this is probably more for you, but Shara, please chime in if you have something else to add. It's about facilitation. So someone asked, would you please talk about facilitation of the activities? The point was made early on for skilled facilitators. That was me in my intro. So I'm interested in how much of this was led by you or your staff or by facilitators that you brought in. I think this is a great question.
Yeah. Well, so as we were getting started, it was FSG that was helping to facilitate. And then as we got our feet wet, I guess, it became then myself, my colleagues, anyone who was like the early adopters who were interested in doing this, and I became more of an advisor of other people facilitating. So we kind of went in stages where FSG taught us how to fish, then I started fishing, and then there were a whole bunch of fishermen. I don't know if that's, but it was first in a kind of a train the trainer kind of model, and then as people started getting comfortable with it, we started testing out a few things, and now we have a cadre of folks who are, I think, comfortable facilitating it. And it's not for everyone. You have to be a good facilitator of reflection and you have to be able to quickly analyze and lead a group in ways that are sometimes difficult. Sometimes we have 100 people in the room, so it's not necessarily an easy task. So we make sure that the person doing it is comfortable doing it, and that we are setting ourselves up for success. I've also found that we need sort of mini facilitators too. So like when I shared the data walk, we had an overarching facilitator that did the whole activity, but then at each data station, we had mini facilitators walking people through those data, because in that particular example that I'm giving, the data were pretty complicated. So it also required some kind of micro facilitation as well. But I think you have to be careful. I think you do have to be careful who facilitates, that they are able to move a group in a certain direction and spend time for reflection. And in the case of if you have complicated data, that you have a person there who understands the data, because we did have to walk people through what they were looking at times.
Great. Shara, did you want to add anything?
I'm okay. I know we have a few more questions. I want to be sure we have a chance to address those.
Okay. And I just to clarify, the word skilled facilitators, again, that was an intentional use of the word skilled, but it doesn't mean professional facilitators. So I want to distinguish that. We're not suggesting in the guide or anywhere else that you need to hire someone who's known for their facilitation skills. But to Pam's point, there are skills that some people have naturally or through their own education and experience that just makes them really good at, as Pam said, moving a group along, handling conflict, listening, and developing the activity itself. So just skills, not necessarily professional. Another question for both of you would be, are any insights on how to best support embedding strategic learning processes within grantee organizations? Another great question. Either of you want to tackle this one?
I mean, I'll give it to Pam here. I'll give it a try, because I actually think it's similar to what I said earlier about getting it into our organization. I think you start with a train the trainer, and then you build the capacity of grantees and hopefully interest by exposing people to different learning activities, and then you let people fly, and you are there for technical assistance as they need help rolling it out. I also think you could do things like add it into expectations around the grant or whatever else, things that make it happen more easily. But I think it's still a train the trainer model.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Pam. Shara?
And sure. I'll add slightly different angle, which is we provide a lot of convening support. We actually sponsor a lot of convenings here at Kresge, and we fundamentally do see those as learning events. And I think that as our emphasis on becoming a more intentional learning organization really takes root here, it is causing us to rethink how we actually approach convening. And so we are starting to do a better job, finally, I think, of asking our nonprofit partners, what do they most need to learn in order to advance their work? How can we support that learning? We also are big believers, and this is, I think, again, a little bit of a different response, but we tend to think often about communities of practice. So those people who are working on different sort of subsets of the same broader issues and might not otherwise see themselves as part of a system, but really finding ways for people to get together to troubleshoot, to ask each other questions, to be part of a something. And I think it does go back to really ensuring that everybody understands that there is a reason for gathering together. So this is sort of back to that point, that it's not so much about we're here now to learn, and learning is separate from the work, but we're here now to learn because it is so central, it is a part of the work.
Mm-hmm. Well, Pam here. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add one more thing, because I don't actually disagree at all. I completely agree. I was thinking of it more how you would get it integrated inside the grantee organization for them to, when you're not around. But absolutely, when we have grantee convenings, it's an easy place to think about how do you create an agenda that is all of this that we've talked about?
Well, that's great, because there was a follow-up to the question, and it had to do with how do you navigate the power dynamics between grantors and grantees effectively in the learning relationship. So is there anything about the learning activities that can help manage that or mediate that power dynamic?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
Hallie, this is Efrain. Can I interject quickly?
Oh, please, yeah.
I think that it's sometimes foundations should reflect on whether it's important for grantees to be by themselves in the learning activity, to be able to take risks. So grantees can take risks about talking about the vulnerabilities, the things that maybe didn't work. So maybe hiring a facilitator that would facilitate the learning in between grantees, and and not be in the room sometimes can be just thinking about whether the founder being in the room can interrupt the learning or not. I think it's important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right.
I agree, Efrain, and I was just thinking that in this question, it's really important to understand what the stakes are, and what the sort of the nature of the relationship, and just knowing that foundations and philanthropic organizations are far-ranging from community foundations that know they're going to be working with partner organizations for a decade or more to some organizations that make grants on a one-year basis, and there's sort of always a sense of, will there be a renewal? Is there another possibility for funding? So I think I definitely hear your point, and would add to that, understanding something about what's at stake and what the dynamics are would be really important to however you move forward.
Well, on that note, I'm going to say, unfortunately, we can't get to all of your questions. They were great questions. Thank you so much for joining us today on learning how to learn, embedding intentional learning into your foundation or organization. We really hope you enjoyed the presentations. And a special thanks to our speakers today, Shara Reed, Pamela Schwartz, and Efrain Gutierrez. Really appreciate you taking the time to share your experiences with us and your passion and excitement for learning. And I just want to say in closing that you can find today's slides and guide on fsg.org, and you'll also be receiving an email with a direct link shortly. And we ask you to take a moment and complete the evaluation that will appear on your screen. Your comments and suggestions are important to us. We are evaluators here, as they will help us to adjust our programming to fit your needs. So thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to continuing the conversation and keep on learning. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.